Well, good evening, everyone. It's a good evening. It's a good evening for storytelling and camaraderie, and well, it looks like we got both going on. So get on close to that fire, get you something in your mug, and try some of them cowboy caramels. I'm passing around the bag down there. I don't know how far they made it. But you track them down and try one of those 12 flavors. They're all natural, you know. I've told you that. Just milk and sugar and cream, just the real stuff. Well, get settled in. We got Dan Barry's daughter. We're going to start with chapter 1 right now. Chapter 1, the wild geese are calling. Sometimes it sounded like the barking of dogs rushing down a trail, closing on their quarry. And again, there was a shower of calls like no other sound on earth. And sometimes single voices came dropping, telling wonderfully of distance. So the wild geese came out of the darkness, dipping towards earth, and were again lost in the northern light. Joan closed her book. Over her shoulder had slipped a heavy braid of dark, metal gold hair. She put it back with an involuntary gesture and raised her face. But all she saw were the hewn beams which supported the upper floor of the ranch house. Darkened by the smoke that had rolled out of the stove on many a winter evening, they still showed every stroke of the axe which had formed them. If she heard the rustling of the newspaper which Buck Daniels lowered to look at her, she paid no attention to him. Not even when he sat up and watched her with a frown of alarm. For she laid aside her book and went to the window. And by pressing close to the pane, she could look past the reflection of the room and the high light which the lamp threw in the glass. She could look past that to the shadow of the desert, and she saw, like ghosts, the shining of stars. She went back outside to the night. She could see far more now, from the line of cottonwoods by the creek bed to the black rolling of the hills towards the west beyond the house, and it seemed to Joan as though the walls of her mind were pushed back also. The stars which she had seen from the window were bright and cold, and still the honking of the wild geese dropped in hurried choruses or lonely single notes. The calling died off towards the north, and she waited through a silence as if for an answer from the earth to those voices from the sky. And when it came, it was from the cottonwoods, perhaps, but it appeared to be blowing from any corner of the compass. The wailing of a coyote. It quavered and it rose. The back door of the house closed and the screen jingling softly. "Joan?" called Buck Daniels. She could not answer at once. It was as though a hand were drawing her back from something beautiful and strange, back to the old familiar commonplaces of the ranch. "Joan?" he called again. This time the sharp note of alarm made her turn quickly. "Yes, Dad," she answered. He came half running towards her. He caught her by the arm. "Why don't you answer up when I called?" he demanded, panting. But he did not wait for an excuse. "You come back into the house," he went on. "Come back out of this darkness, this." She went back obediently beside him, but his hand did not loose her arm even while he was opening and closing the door. He did not even free her when they were back in the kitchen, living room of the house. But holding her at arm's length, he studied her as if her face were a page on which strange things might have been written in the last few moments. "Why didn't you answer when I called you the first time?" he asked again. "Why'd you stop? What were you thinking about? Why'd you go outside, Joan?" She looked upon him with a frank wonder. Time and many sorrows had so seamed and weather-beaten his face that every strong emotion looked like anger. But although his brows beetled and his eyes glared and his lips compressed, she knew that it was fear which had touched him. Fear of what? She had no time to ask or to answer, for he went on again. "You go back to your book. You go right back down and sit there." He actually led her to the chair. He drew it closer to the lamp on the table. "Now, honey," he said when she was seated with the book in her lap, "ain't you comfortable here? Is the light where you want it?" She smiled up to him and saw him turn away to his own place. And so a silence came into the room once more, but it was no longer like the silence which had preceded it, sleepy, dull, a long draw period at the end of the day and the beginning of the night. There was a pulse in this quiet, and Joan began to grow aware of tingling nerves to the tips of her fingers. Buck Daniels spoke again. "Joan." She turned towards him and smiled. "Joan, you ain't happy." He was deeply moved by something, for she could see that he had locked his hands together as if to keep his fingers from showing any unsteadiness. And indeed, there had been something most unusual about his manner of bringing her into the house and his hurried and broken sentences. It could not even come from anything she had done. And while she mused over an answer, she heard the rattling of wheel and the rapid beat of horses' hooves on the road which passed their house not many rods away. And as the noise passed, there was a sudden break of laughter. Deep laughter of men and the sweet, singing laughter of girls. Every voice was like a song to Joan. "Why do you say that?" she asked. Why do you say I'm not happy?" "I'm asking questions, Joan. I ain't stating facts, but tell me true. What you got on your mind, honey?" She shook her head. "Nothing." He pointed at her a forefinger like the pointing of a gun. She studied that worn face behind the hand with wonder and tenderness and pity. "I seen you sitting over your book for 15 minutes and never turning a page. Does that mean that you ain't got nothing on your mind, Joan?" "Oh, I was just thinking," she said. "Of what?" "Of nothing," said Joan, truly feminine. A flush of anger rose to his cheeks, and she marked that jump of his passions by the quick and hard gripping of his fingers. "What made you get up and leave that room a while back?" He cross-examined her. "It was a little warm in here," said Joan. "Joan, it was so plumb chilly that you wondered if it wouldn't be a good idea to start a fire a while back, and you put a coat on instead." It was an attack so direct that she changed color a little. She could only avoid him by suddenly smiling straight in his eyes. "As a matter of fact, I've forgotten why I wanted to leave the room. There was no reason." Buck Daniels sighed. "Have you started in to cover up things from me, Joan? I suppose such things have got to come to every man. The time comes along when his children don't trust him no more. But it's a mighty hard thing to face, honey." She was instantly driven to retreat. "Listen," she exclaimed. And far away they heard another faint and dying burst of laughter down the road. "I never go where other girls go," she said. You mean to dances and such like?" "Yes." "Well, wait till you've growed up, Joan. I'm 18, Dad." He blinked. "What? 18? Nothing but a baby." She said nothing, but looked him quietly in the face. It was a habit of hers. The result was that she was invariably upset. After a moment he could not meet her eyes. She herself looked down, for she was rather ashamed of her power over him. "It's what your mother wanted, Joan. She wanted you to live quiet till you was growed up." "But when will that be?" "Well, maybe when you're 20. 4 years ago you said it would be when I was 18. Instead of answering, he changed the subject. "When you went outside, what were you listening to?" "Well, the wild geese," she answered. There was something in that answer which lifted him from his chair. He walked hastily across the room, pretended that he had gone to find his pipe, and came back frowning and idling with it. "When you heard 'em, Joan, when you heard 'em, what went on inside of you?" It was her turn to be startled. "How did you know that?" she breathed. "Ah, honey," he said, with an air of indescribable sadness, "I know more about you than you'd guess at. I know more about you than you know about yourself." "Then tell me why I went out to listen to the wild geese." He shook his head. And then, drawing his chair closer, he took her hand. She felt that rough, calloused palm stroking her soft skin. When folks take their thoughts and lock 'em up inside of their heads, he said gently, them thoughts begin to get heavier and heavier. Too much silence is sort of a poison, Joan. What did God give us tongues and throats for except to talk out the things that are bothering us? Now, it won't do no good for me to tell you what's wrong. You've got to find out your own words and say it in your own way. And once you've said it, you'll find that you feel a pile easier. Try to tell me, Joan. Behind that quiet voice, she could feel the fear working. What that fear could be of was beyond her guessing. And after a while, she said, of course, the geese are nothing, but they're like milestones along a road. They point out a way, you know. A way to what? A way to what, Joan? Dad, why are you so excited? Excited? Well, I ain't excited, only, oh my God, who ever heard of wild geese as milestones? But go on, Joan. Well, I mean that when I hear them crying in the middle of the sky and know that they're going north. Well, he murmured as she paused. Well, I don't know how it is, but pictures simply tumble into my mind. Of what, dear? Of happiness. Of a queer, sad happiness. A wonderful, lonely, free happiness. He passed a hand hurriedly across his face. Then he peered at her again, anxiously, eagerly. Pictures of happiness? What sort of pictures, Joan? Why, just what everyone thinks about. Of mountains, the big trees, and the wind everywhere, and the noises coming down it, and all sorts of hunting creatures and creatures that are being hunted. You think of all that? Of course, and 1,000 things more. And sometimes when I listen, I feel as though I were trying to remember some things that I've known before. I don't know just what it is, but I begin to ache with longing, Dad. My whole heart begins to ache, you know, to get north and find that place. What place? Well, I don't exactly know, but I think if I found it, I'd recognize it. A place where one could be wonderfully happy. Now, that would be the end of the journey until what? Well, but in the fall, when they fly south. He had dropped his face upon his hands, but she was so deep in her thoughts that she did not see that. For she was feeling her way through an undiscovered country in her mind. But in the fall, when the days begin to grow shorter and the wild geese fly south, of course, they're pointing to much different things. One can't help thinking of warm winds and great blue bayous and reeds as high as one's head around the shores, and flowers, even in winter. Joan, what put this into your head? She looked closely at him now, and she saw enough in his face to make her cry out. Why, Dad, you're as pale as a ghost. Are you sick? No, no. Is there anything so very wrong in what I've said? No, but... And he paused again, struggling with his explanation. I once knew a man who found all those things in his head when the wild geese flew over. Oh, cried Joan, tell me about him. But he drew himself back from her and exclaimed sharply, Never ask me about him. Oh, was he an enemy of yours? Asked Joan. He was my dearest friend. And to the utter wonder of Joan, she saw that tears were in the eyes of Buck Daniels. It was the more mysterious because, so far as she knew, he had no friends. And if he insisted that she lead the life of a hermit on the ranch, seeing no young company, meeting no one indeed, old or young, he led the same life himself, driving to town only for supplies and coming hastily home again. She had thought of him as a recluse always. Indeed, how he could have met and managed to win the love of her mother, she could never have imagined. This was the opening the book to the unexpected place. This was the fine poetry instead of a prose. But surely, said Joan, you can tell me about him. You? Cried Buck Daniels, starting from his chair beside her. Not for the whole world, and it's time for you to turn in, Joan. It's your bedtime. Now you run along. And she hesitated. There was a storm of questions lying locked behind her teeth, but she let them remain unspoken. When this man chose to be silent, there was no winning him to speech. And besides, he'd said enough to make her wish to be alone, so that she could turn all that had happened over and over in her mind. So after that thoughtful instant, she kissed that bronzed cheek of the big man, went slowly up the stairway, which creaked and groaned beneath her footfalls. Buck Daniels watched her going with an anguished face, and when she had disappeared, he swiftly packed a pipe, lighted it, and went outside to walk up and down, for a long time. It was the beginning of the end, he felt, and he was filled with a cold and helpless sense of doom. The tobacco had long burned to an ash before he finally went inside again. Up the stairs he climbed, and he paused at the door of the girl. "Joan," he called very gently. There was no answer, and confident that she was asleep, he went on to his own room. But Joan only waited until his footfall had gone down the hall. Then she slipped from her bed. Chapter 2, Where the Law Slept. To Hal Springer and Rudy Nichols, the setting of the sun was most welcome. For when one has broken ground all day, and when that ground is hard quartz, fatigue becomes a thing which bites clear to the soul. And as a matter of fact, they could not have sustained the burden as well as they had done it had there not been for certain gleaming little threads of rich yellow in the stone, which told them that their labor now meant rest in the days to come. When they laid aside their double jacks and their drills, however, they did not instantly set about preparing supper. They were too wise for that, for they first sat down on a stone and lighted their pipes. To be sure, the twilight would make the cooking of supper more difficult, more unpleasant, but this small interval was refreshing their muscles, their very hearts. They did not even waste strength in words, but from the mountainside they looked out with mild, tired eyes upon the progress of the shadows in the valley. They were of an age, perhaps 45, and although in body and feature they were as different as men could be, yet their expressions were so similar that they might have been taken for brothers. For each of them had spent 20 years wandering through the mountains, steering a course sighted between the ears of the burro which was driven ahead. They had chipped rocks with their hammers from Canada to Mexico. Their minds were packed with all manner of information about strange trails, strange adventures, and strange as was their knowledge, their hopes were even stranger. Each of them felt that they had rubbed elbows with huge fortunes time and again. Each of them kept in the back of his mind precious information about spots where gold just had to be. Each of them had lived so long a solitary life that this association with two others seemed like existence in the midst of a roaring crowd. Now the third partner, Harry Gloucester, was absently hunting to stock their larder, and his absence was welcome. Now it wasn't that they disliked him, but they preferred absolute solitude to any human company, and next to absolute solitude it was best to be near one of their own kind, calm and silent and gray as a stone, with eyes worn dull by searching for the spot where that rainbow touches the earth. They began to hear now, with sharp sound of shod hoofs striking the rocks below them, a noise which constantly climbed closer. Now they knew who it was. Matter of fact, for the last 2 hours they'd been watching this rider working up the valley from far away, the distance diminishing his size, although the clear mountain air let them see him distinctly enough. They'd watched him from time to time when they had come out from the shaft to let the wind blow them cool, but neither had said a word to the other. As a matter of fact, they'd not spoken a syllable since Gloucester left them early that morning. But as that noise of the horse came closer, Hal Springer went to the little shack, the half cabin, and their dugout, in which they bunked, and came back wearing his cartridge belt with a revolver dragging the right side of it far down over the hip. His companion, appeared not to take the slightest note of his preparation. He seemed to be only intent upon certain light effects and climbing shadows which were blurring the harsh outlines of a southern peak. But after a dozen puffs of his pipe, he also arose and went to the shack, and returned similarly accoutered. He had barely appeared when that stranger come into view. He'd been obscured for some time by that sharp angle of the mountainside, and now he was seen to be a feller in the prime of life, wide-shouldered, long-armed, and sitting as lightly in the saddle as if he'd not been riding hard throughout the entire day. He dismounted, throwing his reins, while that hungry horse, daring not to move, reached in a guilty fashion after a blade of grass which was near its head. "Hello, Hal," he said. "How's things?" "Things are tolerable well, MacArthur," said Springer, and he took the hand of the other in a relaxed grip. It was plain that he was not nearly as well pleased to be seen as to see. "This is Rudy Nichols," he said. "Make you known to Joe MacArthur, Rudy." The two shook hands, but MacArthur swung back to Springer. He wasted no time in preliminary remarks, but he went directly to the point, which was what one would expect from his strong features and his steady bright eyes. "The damn vein pinched out on me," he said. There was no response other than a puff of smoke from Springer's pipe. "Looked like the real thing," went on MacArthur. Then it faded. "Never was worse fooled in my life. Showed the thing to old man Shaughnessy, and he said the same thing." "Too bad," drawled Springer, without interest. "So your grub strake was throwed away," went on MacArthur. Springer shrugged his shoulders. He appeared to found with his glance the same mountain which so fascinated Nichols just a short time ago. He studied it as one stares at a picture of dubious merit, making a judgment. "Well, what I'm up here about," went on MacArthur smoothly, taking a seat on a rock, which enabled him to face Springer, and at the same time shifting some tobacco into a brown cigarette paper. "What I'm up here about is another grub stake." The silence of Springer was as profound as the silence of the mountains around him. "I've found the real thing at last," went on MacArthur, as he twisted and he licked his cigarette. He lighted it, and he turned his head to watch the match fall. "If I told you all the facts about where and what it was, you'd pack up your things and you'd leave this here hole in the ground and come along with me." "Maybe," said Springer. "It's rich," cried MacArthur with a contagious enthusiasm. "All you got to do is give the rock one clip with a hammer and you see enough to start you dancing." "I've done my dancing," drawled Springer. "Hal," said MacArthur, leaning forward and speaking in the soft voice of persuasion, "you may have used up a lot of hope on me since that last job didn't pan out, but take this from me, you're a fool if you don't try another try. I could have got back in a good many places with a specimen like this to show, but I wanted you to get your money back, and more, too. So I come clear up here instead of showing this here ore to Milligan or to one of them rich gents that ain't got the guts to gamble on nothing but a sure thing. Just take a look at this." And he tossed a little fragment of rock to Springer. "Take a look at your hoss," said Springer. MacArthur turned. The pony, straying away after a tempting bunch of grass, had been held back by the reins catching on a projecting rock. A strong jerk of the head had broken the headband and allowed the bridle to slip down. "Well, that darned old fool," exclaimed MacArthur. "But he'll stand without no bridle at all. What do you think of that sample, Hal?" "For a sample," murmured Springer, "it looks like something," and he tossed it back. The other pocketed that specimen in silence. His jaw had thrust out and his scowl was black. "That means you don't give a damn about making your fortune?" he asked. There was another depressing interval of silence. "Hal," said MacArthur at last, "don't you believe me?" There was another little interval of dragging pause in which Nichols discovered something of interest, some distance down the slope, and rose and sauntered down. "I don't believe in you," answered Springer at last. with all the deliberation of a matured judgment. When I grub-staked you, I was drunk. You got me when I was in town drunk. And you worked on me until I handed over enough money for you to use as a grub-stake, as you called it. That made us come up to this job short of everything that we needed. MacArthur bit his lip. Look at this sample, though, he pleaded, fighting down his passion. Samples ain't hard to get. Some buy 'em and some borrow 'em. MacArthur rose to his feet. It was too direct an affront. Springer, he said, what do you mean by that? I mean just this, said the other, spelling out the words on his fingers. I've looked you up, and what I've heard would have made a dog sick. You ain't no good, MacArthur. You skinned me out of one neat little bunch of money, and you won't skin me out of another. And that's the straight of it. I'm through with your kind. I've heard how you... Oh, he stopped. Something had happened to MacArthur like a silent explosion. His lips were trembling, and his lean face seemed to have swollen up. You damned old fool, he whispered. Now look here, began Springer, but instead of finishing his sentence with a gasp, which let the pipe fall from between his teeth, he reached for his gun. It glided out of the scabbard with an ease which told of a skill which had at one time perhaps been great. But fast as his movement was, it was like standing still compared with the flying hand of MacArthur. His gun spoke before the muzzle of Springer's revolver was clear of the leather, and the miner, with a cough, twisted around and slumped over to one side. There was a yell from Rudy Nichols. You damned cutthroat, he was screaming, his voice thrown into a high falsetto by his emotion, and he ran forward, pumping away with his revolver. Not a bullet hummed close to the mark. His aim was so wild that MacArthur raised his own weapon with the calm precision of one firing at a target, and Nichols pitched on his face while his gun rolled and clattered down the slope. MacArthur waited until the echoes had died down. He faced his horse, which had raised its head and was regarding the motionless bodies with mild interest. This is hell, breathed MacArthur. I didn't mean. However, this thing was done. Since it was accomplished, only a fool would let a twinge of conscience drive him away before he reaped the harvest of a crime. He went to the shack, searched it thoroughly, and found a little cash, a 10-pound sack of gold, which was a prize almost worth the shooting, he decided. And finally, he took from the wall a bridle which had to replace his own broken one. In 5 minutes he was riding down that mountain again. He paused at the first crossing of the river in the valley. He tied a heavy rock to his bridle and threw it in. And after that, how was any human being to tell that he'd been there? For not a soul in the world knew to what destination he'd been riding that day, and certainly the keenest eyes in the world could never trace him over the rocks on which he'd been riding. But before he had reached that river, Harry Gloucester returned to the mine, and he returned leading his horse, which was loaded down with game. He was a poor shot. Practice had never been able to help the skill of the big fella, but luck had been with him 20 times this day. It seemed he just could not miss. He came back, however, to the black and silent cabin, and when he lighted the lantern, he carried it out and found the 2 dead men laying as they had fallen. The lantern shuddered in his hand. First he hurried back to the cabin. The motive for the double killing was patent at once, for the gold was gone. He went back and carried the dead men to the same spot, and when they lay on their backs with the dirt brushed from their faces, they were wonderfully unchanged from the 2 that he had left that morning. They must be buried, and he buried them in miner's fashion. He took them to the old shaft which they had begun to dig until that false vein had disappeared, and at the mouth of the hole he sank a drill a few inches, wielding a double jack with one hand and raining the blows as if he were swinging a carpenter's hammer, for he was a giant of strength. Then he put in his stick of powder, lighted the fuse, and watched that explosion roll 20 tons of stone across that entrance. Now for the ride to town. He saddled his horse, the only horse of the three which they pastured near the mine which was capable of bearing his weight. It was not until the saddle was in place that the other thought came to him. Suppose that he rode into town and told them what he had found. They would come pouring out to see the site of the tragedy. But no sooner were they there than they would begin to ask questions, and those questions would be prompted by the discovery that the mine was paying in rich ore. A rich mine owned by three partners, of whom two are suddenly and sadly killed. How fortunate, how extremely fortunate for the third member of the group. It came sickeningly home to him. He was new to that land. No one knew him. No one would vouch for him. Strangers could compose that jury that tried him. A strange judge would advise them, and a furious prosecutor would pour forth his eloquence about this dastardly crime, the murder of two honest old prospectors. Now sweat stood upon his forehead. Sweat poured out to his armpits, and every mile that he traveled gave him time for thoughts. The beat of the hoofs of his horse turned into words, and they were the words of the charge of the judge to the jury, pointing out all the damning evidence, and in summing up, showed that if such crime went unpunished, it would encourage other men to destroy their partners when a mine began to pay off. For how simple was it in the lonely mountains to destroy a man, and how easy it was to put the blame upon an unknown stranger and say that one had been out hunting that day. He went to the town, indeed, but he did not ride into the center of it. Instead, he left his horse at the outskirts, saddle and all. Then he paused a moment to rub the nose of the honest mustang and murmur, "They'll find you, old-timer. They'll give you some chuck. I know you're hungry as sin." And then he went on. He sneaked through the village. He came to the railroad station, and half an hour later he was aboard a freight train and bound for parts farther south. When the rattling wheels had spun beneath the train for 2 hours, he dropped off at a place where it had stopped for water. For he must leave a broken trail behind him, he decided, and he was already far, far away from the place of the double murder. He cut across the country. In the gray of the dawn, when day could hardly have been said to have begun, he come to a ranch house. And there in the barn he found a saddle and a bridle. In the corral were a dozen horses. He picked the stoutest, without regards for lines, which might indicate speed, for his first requirement of a horse was the strength to bear up his unusual bulk. And on the back of this animal he threw the saddle, lowered the bars, led the horse out, then rode south at a steady jog. It would not do to use too much early speed, for the road was long which led across the desert. But somewhere ahead of him was Mexico, and there, unless men lied, the law sometimes slept. Chapter 3. The Clenched Fist. There was a fluster in the kitchen of the hotel. The heart of Mary, the waitress, chambermaid, and occasionally clerk in the general merchandise store, was full. She had to talk. She would have talked to the wall had not the Chinese cook been there. "He's about that tall," said Mary, reaching high above her head. "Now he's about that broad. Why, he'd fill that door plumb full. And he's all man, Woo. There he goes now. He's finished washing up and he's going around in front. Look quick through the window." But Woo, with a grunt, which might have been directed either at the frying steak or her remark, turned his narrow back upon her and reached for the salt. One glance showed Mary that her confidant was a thing of stone. So she kneeled on the chair and poured her heart through the window towards that big man. He was not quite as large as she'd made him out, but he was big enough. He was one of those men who carried about them an air of conscious strength, such a high-headed and frank-eyed good nature, and they appear larger than they are. He carried his hat in his hand, which showed all of a handsome sun-browned face. He had taken off his bandana also, and opened his shirt at the throat in the evening air. His whole manner was one of utter carelessness, and Mary, when she had peered until he was out of sight, sat down suddenly in the chair with her head thrown back and a foolish little smile upon her lips. As for Harry Gloster, he paused at the front of the building to laugh at two sweating boys who, in the middle of a great dust cloud, were attempting to drive back a pig which had broken through the fence on the farther side of the street. Then he entered the hotel and went into the dining room. There was only one other present, and this was a pleasant companion. He was one of those men who showed age in the face and not in the body. His shoulders were as wide, his chest as high arched, and the carriage of his head as noble as that of any athletic youth. But his hair was almost a silver gray, and his face was broken and haggard with time and trouble. If this face alone were noted, he looked all of 60. But taking his erect and strong body into consideration, one reduced that age down to 45. And that must have come close to the truth. Harry Gloster waved a hand in greeting and sat down beside the other. "Riding through or living here?" he asked. "Riding through," answered the older man. "You?" "Just blowing north," said Harry Gloster. "Well, so am I," said the other. "In a rush, as a matter of fact. We might ride on together tomorrow." Harry Gloster eyed him askance. "I may be starting in a little while. May not wait for morning," he parried. He could have sworn that the other smiled, although very faintly, and Gloster leaned suddenly forward and looked his companion squarely in the eyes. "What's on your mind?" he asked sharply. The older man hesitated an instant, and then he laughed. He added, speaking softly, "It's all right, son, but there's no red dirt of that color south of the town. You're just off that Pebbleford trail. You're heading south." The twinkle in his eyes focused to a gleam. "You're for the Rio Grande. Pronto." He spoke just in time to save the heart of Mary from a complete wreckage, for at that very moment she came in, staggering under the weight of a great tray of food and dishes, yet with her glance fastened on the face of Harry Gloster, who gave her not a look. To be sure, she had not changed color at the last words of the table-mate. He even managed to maintain a smile. But the big muscles at the base of his jaw were bulging a little, and he stared straight before him. The moment Mary had gone again, however, with a last languishing glance from the door to the kitchen, Gloster touched the arm of the other. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. "Nothing," said the older man. "Nothing except that I don't like to be bluffed." He made a gesture of perfect openness with a bandaged right hand. "You have nothing to fear from me," he added quietly. And at this, Harry Gloster grew a little bit pale. "What do you know?" he said. "Well, if I were a sheriff," said the other, "I'd lock you up on suspicion and hold you until I'd had a look at your back trail. But I'm not sheriff, not by a considerable distance." "Then that's finished?" "It is." They exchanged eloquent glances, and Harry Gloster drew a great breath of relief. Before he could speak again, a third man had entered the room, stopped short, and his glance fell upon Gloster's companion, and then advanced again slowly, with an indescribable change in his manner and step which told that he was facing danger. As for the man beside Gloster, he too had altered, sitting a little straighter in his chair, and with an outthrust of his lower jaw. Yet he had calmed enough. "Hello, Joe." "Howdy," nodded the other. "Kind of far south for you, Lee, ain't it?" "A little far south," answered Lee, while the other drew back a chair with his left hand and sat down gingerly, slowly, never taking his eyes from Lee. He was one of those long-legged, long-armed men whose weight is condensed almost entirely around Herculean shoulders. He was handsome, in a way, but his features were all overshadowed, as one might say, by the very shadow of his physical strength. It showed in the straight line of his compressed mouth, in the forward jutting of his head, and most significantly in that cruel flare of the nostrils. "Yes," went on Lee as calmly as before, "I'm a little farther south than usual. I'm on a trail. Maybe you could give me a few pointers, Joe." Joe grinned. There was no mirth in his smile. "Sure," he said dryly. "Ain't it natural for me to do anything for you that I could? Now here's where Mary came to get the order of the newcomer." He snapped a request for ham and eggs at her without moving his eyes from Lee. "I'm looking for a woman," said Lee, continuing as soon as the girl had left the room. "We all are," said Joe, grinning again. "Her name," said Lee, "is Kate Cumberland. That is, it used to be. She's the widow of Dan Barry." "Never heard of her or him," said Joe. "Or of Jim Silent?" asked Lee, and it seemed to Larry Coster that there was a tremor of seriousness in the manner of the speaker. "Silent? Nope." "Or you?" asked Lee, glancing earnestly at Gloucester. "Never heard of him. Who was he?" "I have no luck," said Lee, deep in gloom and avoiding the direct question. "That trail has gone out." The comment of Joe was a grim and cruel disinterest. And Harry Gloucester said kindly, "Old friends of yours?" "Dan Barry? An old friend?" muttered Lee, as much to himself as to the others. "I don't know." He sighed and he looked across the room with blank eyes. "God knows what he was to me or to any other human being." And he added sadly, "He was a man that I wronged, and he was a man who gave me his life when he had it like that, to take it if he wanted it." He raised his hand and he closed it as though he were crushing an invisible something against his palm. "Well," said Joe with sinister meaning, "gents like that come few and far between, eh?" "They do," answered Lee. "There are some folks that hold a small grudge to the end of time. I've met men like that." The meaning could not be misunderstood. And suddenly Joe turned white. It was not hard to see that a great emotion had been working in him ever since he entered that room. And now it leaped up from his heart and it mastered him. His head lowered and thrust out a bit more than usual, he pushed back his chair somewhat from the table, so as to give his knees clearance for quick action, and his right hand dropped patently close to his hip. "You've met one of them men in me, Haines," he said, breathing hard, yet growing whiter and whiter as the passion mounted. "I've been thinking and thinking about you and me, and I'm tolerable glad that we've met up. Tolerable glad." And indeed, the battle lust shook him like a leaf. Harry Gloucester eyed them shrewdly. He'd been among fighting men all his life. They were a sort of a language which he could read with a perfect fluency. But as he looked from one to the other of these two, he could not tell which was the more formidable. There was more nervous energy in Joe, to be sure, but in that man who had just been called Haines, there was a calm reserve of strength which might be employed in this crisis. He was older, to be sure, but he was not yet old enough to be slow. Now, there was one determining factor which Gloucester could see, but Joe could not. The right hand of Haines had been kept scrupulously out of sight beneath the table from the moment Joe entered. It had appeared to Harry at first that this might be from fear lest the other should note his infirmity and take advantage of it to fly at his throat. But now that the actual danger of battle had become almost unavoidable, there might be another reason which induced Haines to conceal his wound, and that was an indomitable pride which kept him from taking advantage of the weakness to put off a danger. And in fact, he was now meeting the last outburst of Joe with a calm smile of scorn. Yet certainly he was helpless. The 4 fingers of his right hand were bound together with one bandage. He could not possibly use a gun under such a handicap, unless he were ambidextrous, and on the left side he wore no gun. To reach across to his right hip would be impossible. Opposite him there was a man quivering with hate, with murder in his face. At the first suspicious move he would strike, and his stroke would be devastating as a lightning flash. "Wait a minute," cried Gloucester. "Wait a minute, will you? My friend here has a bad hand. He can't—" You canny people along to beg off for you, sneered Joe. I've never met this man before, said Haines slowly, and I need no advice or help. When I fight a rat, I fight alone. It came home to Harry Gloster with a sickening surety. It was simply the suicide of a man tired of life, and preferring to die by the hand of another rather than his own. He watched the lip of Joe curl. He saw him take a short breath, as if he were drinking the insult to the last drop. And then there was a convulsive movement of his right arm. The elbow jerked back and up, and the big revolver came spinning out of its holster. Lee Haines had not stirred. Indeed, the smile with which he had uttered his last remark was still on his lips. But Harry Gloster had begun to move the split part of a second before that man crossed the table. It was a long distance, but the arm of Gloster was a long arm. One foot planted behind him braced his weight. His fist shot across the table with all his bulk in motion behind it. His hip struck the table, tilted it, sent the crockery spilling and crashing to the floor. But before the first cup fell, his fist cracked on the point of the aggressor's jaw. Had it landed solidly, it would have knocked Joe half the length of the room. But as it was, he flinched back at the last instant, seeing the flying danger from the corner of his eyes. So that blow merely grazed the bone and partly stunned him for the fraction of a minute. He staggered up from the chair and back a step. The revolver dropped down to the tips of his unnerved fingers and hung there by the trigger guard. The very curse which he uttered was blurred and half-spoken. "Keep out of this," commanded Haines, and reached for the shoulder of his table companion. His grip was strong, but his fingers slipped from the mass of contracted muscles. He might as well have laid an arresting hand on the flank of an avalanche. Harry Gloster went over the table and landed first with his fist on the face of Joe, and secondly with his feet on the floor. The half-numbed fingers of Joe were gathering the revolver again. The blow landed in the nick of time, and it ended the fight, whirled him about and pitched him into the wall with a force that jarred the whole room. He slumped loosely back upon the floor. Mary, brought by the uproar to the door of the kitchen, screamed and ran back, and Woo raised a shrill chattering. Lee Haines was already kneeling beside that fallen man, whom he turned on his back. "God, not even a broken jaw," he said. "He must be made of India rubber." He arose and faced Gloster and laid his bandaged hand on the shoulder of the other. His calm was amazing to Harry Gloster. "That was some fast work," Haines said, "and it saved me from being filled full of lead, which is bad enough, or begging off, which is worse. But if you're headed for the Rio Grande, don't let this hold you back. And if you come back again, don't come back this way. He's bad medicine, you understand?" "I've never sidestepped a man yet," Harry Gloster replied, shaking his head. "You're not too old to form a good habit," Haines rejoined. He scanned the magnificent body of Gloster, and last of all his glance dwelt on the hands. His own fingers, and those of Joe, lying unconscious on the floor, were long and slender and bony, intended for movements of electric speed. But the fingers of Harry Gloster were square-tipped and built for crushing power. "No," he continued, "you keep away from him and you'll have better luck. And start moving now." There was such a solemn assurance in his voice that it was impossible for Harry Gloster to answer. He looked down again to the long arms of Joe sprawled across the floor, and to the long-fingered, sun-blackened hands, and a shudder of instinctive dread passed through Gloster. He turned to speak again to Lee Haines, to learn some things of the history and the accomplishments of this man, of his full name. But Haines was already moving swiftly through the door. Well, there's the first three of Dan Barry's Daughter. Sounds kind of like the first two books we read, but it's got some interest and a little different thing going on. Wonder how Joan's going to play into this. Good old story. Well, there's a few more of them caramels there. If you want to get some for yourself and get your kids and your family involved in them, you can buy you some off our store. You just go ahead and click on that shop button and you get you some of them caramels. You'll like them. They're all natural and man are they good. Well, next time I see you, we'll tell some more stories. We'll enjoy some more fires. And it'll be a week or so later. So until then, this is Clay Steele. Good night.